There is a moment in every person's life when they finally realize something uncomfortable. Not about the world, not about other people, but about themselves. That most of what they call being nice was never really about kindness. It was about fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of conflict. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of not being liked if they spoke too honestly, too directly, too clearly. And without even noticing it, that fear starts shaping everything. The way you speak, the way you agree, the way you stay quiet when something doesn't feel right, the way you smile through things you should have questioned. And slowly, something changes inside you. You stop living from truth and start living from reaction. You begin managing people instead of expressing yourself. You start measuring every word based on how it will be received, not whether it is real. And here is the part almost nobody realizes until it is too late. People don't lose respect for you in one big moment. No, they lose respect for the version of you that never pushed back. The version of you that never said no. The version of you that kept choosing peace over honesty until peace became performance. And the most dangerous part? You don't even notice it happening. Because it doesn't feel like losing yourself. It feels like being good. But there is a point where being good to everyone else becomes a quiet betrayal of yourself. And once you see that line clearly, you can never unsee it again. Because from that moment on, every time you stay silent, every time you say yes when you mean no, but every time you swallow your truth just to keep things comfortable, you will feel it. Not as guilt, but as awareness. And that awareness changes everything. Because it forces you to ask a question most people avoid their entire lives. How much of my life have I already given away just to be liked? And if that question hits you even slightly, then what comes next will change the way you see respect, boundaries, and yourself forever. Most people misunderstand what it actually means to be nice. They treat it like a moral achievement, something to be proud of, something that automatically signals goodness, maturity, or emotional intelligence. But in reality, niceness is often not about character at all. It is about conditioning. It is about learning, often early in life, that acceptance is earned through compliance, silence, and emotional restraint. And once that conditioning sets in, it becomes invisible. You don't even realize you're doing it anymore. You just start shaping yourself around what keeps other people comfortable. You smile when you don't mean it. You agree when you don't believe it. You stay quiet when something feels wrong, and you call it maturity. But what is actually happening underneath is much deeper. You are slowly disconnecting from your internal signals. The very instincts that are designed to protect your self-respect begin to fade into the background because you have trained yourself to override them for approval. And here is the psychological shift most people never notice. Every time you suppress your truth to be nice, you are reinforcing a message to yourself. My experience is less important than their comfort. At first it feels harmless, even noble. You avoid conflict. You keep things smooth. People describe you as easygoing, kind, pleasant. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. You start losing clarity about what you actually think. You hesitate longer before speaking. You second-guess your reactions. And eventually, you stop trusting your own discomfort. That is not kindness. That is self-erasure in small, repeated moments. And the more you do it, the more it becomes your identity. Because people don't just respond to how you treat them, they also respond to how consistently you abandon yourself. And once that pattern is established, the world adjusts to it. People begin to feel entitled to your silence. They expect your agreement. They assume your flexibility. Not because they are necessarily bad people, but because you have trained them to expect no resistance from you. And this is where niceness becomes dangerous. Not because kindness is wrong, but because unexamined niceness removes friction from relationships that actually need structure. Think about it carefully. A person who never says no is not seen as generous forever. They are seen as available. And availability without boundaries is often mistaken for permission. So slowly, without anyone having to consciously decide it, your role in relationships begins to shift. You become the one who accommodates, the one who adjusts, the one who absorbs tension so others don't have to. And the most dangerous part is that you may even feel proud of it, because society rewards it at first. People like you more when you are easy to deal with. You get less conflict, fewer confrontations, more temporary approval. But approval is not the same as respect. Approval is emotional convenience. Respect is behavioral awareness, and those two things rarely grow in the same place. There is also a deeper psychological mechanism at play here. When you repeatedly override your discomfort to be nice, your nervous system starts recalibrating what is normal. What once felt slightly off begins to feel tolerable. What once felt like disrespect starts to feel like not a big deal. And this is how boundaries don't just weaken externally, they dissolve internally. You stop recognizing when something crosses a line because you have trained yourself not to respond to the line at all. That is why people who are overly nice often describe the same experience later in life. They say things like, "I don't know when it started, but people just stopped respecting me." Or, "I don't know how I ended up in situations where I feel used." But it did not start suddenly. It started in the smallest possible moments. The moment you laughed off something that hurt you, the moment you said it's fine when it wasn't, the moment you stayed silent to avoid awkwardness, the moment you chose harmony over honesty. Each one seemed insignificant. But together, they formed a pattern. And that pattern taught everyone around you how far they could go, because people are always learning your limits, even when you are not expressing them. And if you don't define your limits clearly, others will define them for you through repetition. This is where many people get stuck. They confuse being nice with being safe. They believe that avoiding discomfort will protect their relationships, their reputation, or their peace of mind. But real peace does not come from avoidance. It comes from alignment. And alignment requires truth, even uncomfortable truth. Because the truth is this: if you are constantly suppressing yourself to maintain harmony, then the harmony you are maintaining is not real. It is conditional. It is dependent on your silence. And anything that depends on your silence is not stable. It is fragile. So the question is not whether being nice is good or bad. The question is whether your version of nice is costing you your presence in your own life. Because there is a point where you have to decide. Do you want to be liked for being easy to overlook, or respected for being impossible to ignore? And those two paths require completely different versions of you. One requires you to keep shrinking. The other requires you to start standing still, even when it is uncomfortable. Because the truth is, people who are truly grounded are not the ones who never create tension. They are the ones who no longer fear it. They can sit in silence without rushing to fix it. They can disagree without apologizing for existing. They can say no without collapsing into guilt. And that is not personality. That is self-respect in action. So if you are beginning to see how niceness has shaped your life, do not rush to judge yourself for it. Understand it. See where it came from. See how it helped you survive certain environments. But also recognize when survival habits outlive their purpose. Because what once protected you can eventually start limiting you. And at that point, the real work is not becoming less kind. It is becoming more honest, more grounded, more aware, more willing to tolerate the discomfort of being real instead of the comfort of being liked. And when you reach that point, you stop asking how to be nicer. You start asking a far more powerful question. What parts of myself have I been silencing just to be accepted? Because the moment you answer that honestly, you stop living as a reaction to others and start living as a responsibility to yourself. People like to think boundaries are something you announce once and then everyone respects forever. That is not how it works. Boundaries are not statements. They are patterns. And people are always studying your patterns, even when you are not speaking. This is why one of the most important truths you will ever understand in relationships is this. People don't treat you based on what you say. They treat you based on what you consistently allow. Let that settle for a moment. Because this explains almost every situation where someone says, "I don't know how it got this bad," or "I never thought they would treat me like this." It didn't start with something big. It started with something small that was ignored. A comment you didn't challenge, a request you didn't question, a tone you didn't address, a behavior you laughed off even though it didn't sit right with you. Each moment by itself feels insignificant, almost not worth the energy of a reaction. But psychology doesn't work in isolated moments. It works in repetition, and repetition becomes instruction. When you don't respond to disrespect, you are not staying neutral. You are teaching. You are teaching that the line didn't matter. And once that lesson is learned, people don't keep testing it out of cruelty. They test it out of habit. They push a little further, not because they hate you, but because nothing stopped them last time. This is where niceness becomes a liability. Because nice people often prioritize harmony over correction. They assume that if something feels off, ignoring it will preserve peace. But what actually happens is very different. Unaddressed behavior does not disappear. It evolves. It becomes more confident, more frequent, more embedded in the relationship dynamic. And suddenly, what started as a small discomfort becomes a consistent pattern. And by the time you finally feel overwhelmed by it, the other person is confused. Because from their perspective, nothing has changed. They are just doing what has always been allowed. That is the silent cost of inconsistency. Now, here is where it gets deeper psychologically. Human beings are not constantly evaluating what is right or wrong in their interactions. Most people operate on feedback loops. If something is met with resistance, they adjust. If something is met with silence, they proceed. If something is met with laughter, they escalate. Not out of malice, but out of learning. So every interaction you have is quietly shaping the behavior of others toward you. Which means boundaries are not just about protection. They are about instruction. You are constantly teaching people how to exist around you. And the question is not whether you are teaching them something. You always are. The question is whether you are conscious of what you are teaching. Because when you avoid discomfort to keep the peace, you are actually creating a different kind of structure. A structure where your needs are optional, where your silence is expected, where your discomfort is invisible. And once that structure is in place, it does not stay confined to one relationship. It spreads. You begin noticing similar patterns everywhere, at work, in friendships, in family dynamics, different people, same experience. Because the common denominator is not them, it is the pattern you bring into the interaction. And here is the part most people struggle to accept. People will not correct your boundaries for you. They will operate within the boundaries you demonstrate, not the ones you intend. So if your boundary only exists in your mind, it does not exist in the relationship. This is why so many people feel unheard even when they are constantly explaining themselves. Explanation is not the same as enforcement. You can talk about your limits endlessly, but if there is no behavioral consequence when those limits are crossed, then they are not limits at all. They are preferences, and preferences are negotiable. Now think about what that means. Every time you stay silent to avoid tension, you are not removing conflict from your life. You are relocating it. It doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It shows up later as resentment, exhaustion, emotional distance, or sudden outbursts that feel disproportionate to the situation. But they are not disproportionate. They are delayed. They are the result of unspoken moments stacking up over time. And eventually, something small becomes the final trigger for everything that was never addressed. This is why people say, it came out of nowhere, when in reality, it came from everywhere they ignored. So what does it actually mean to set a boundary in practice? It is not about being harsh. It is not about controlling others. It is not about creating conflict for the sake of proving a point. It is about consistency. It is about letting your behavior match your internal limits. If something crosses a line, you acknowledge it. If something continues to cross that line, you adjust your access. If something repeatedly disregards that line, you stop participating in it. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but clearly, because clarity is what creates structure, and structure is what earns respect. Without structure, relationships become interpretive. Everyone is guessing. Everyone is adjusting. Everyone is unconsciously testing what they can get away with. But with structure, there is stability. People know where they stand. You know where you stand. And energy stops being wasted on confusion. Now here is something important to understand. When you start enforcing boundaries, you will not only change how others treat you, you will also change how they respond emotionally to you. Some people will adjust quickly. They will respect the clarity and adapt. Others will resist. Not because your boundary is wrong, but because your consistency removes their access to something they were used to. And this is where many people revert back to old habits. They feel guilty for enforcing something that disrupts someone else's comfort. But discomfort is not the same as harm. And someone else's discomfort does not automatically mean you are doing something wrong. It often just means the dynamic is changing. And change always creates friction. But friction is not failure. Friction is adjustment. It is the moment a pattern is being rewritten. So when you finally stop tolerating small violations, do not expect immediate harmony. Expect recalibration. Because people are not just responding to your words. They are adjusting to your new standard. And standards take time to settle. But once they do, everything becomes simpler. You no longer need to explain yourself repeatedly. You no longer need to justify your reactions. You no longer need to manage misunderstandings that come from unclear boundaries. Because your presence becomes consistent. And consistency removes confusion. So the real power is not in reacting strongly. It is in responding consistently. It is in showing people, through repetition, that your limits are not emotional moments. They are structural realities. And when that becomes clear, something shifts in how the world interacts with you. Not because you became more demanding, but because you became more defined. And people respond differently to definition than they do to flexibility. Because flexibility invites testing. Definition creates awareness. And awareness creates respect. So if there is one thing to take from this, it is this. You are always teaching people how to treat you, whether you intend to or not. The only question is whether you are doing it consciously or by default. Because what you allow repeatedly becomes what you accept internally. And what you accept internally becomes the life you live externally. So the moment you start choosing what you allow, you stop living reactively. And you start living deliberately. And that is where real change begins. Not in confrontation, but in consistency. And the quiet decision to no longer repeat what keeps costing you respect. People often assume people-pleasing is just about being too nice. But it is deeper than that. It is not a personality trait. It is a strategy. A strategy built on one quiet belief. If I can manage how people feel about me, I can stay safe. And at first, that strategy works. You learn how to read the room. You learn how to adjust your tone. You learn how to anticipate reactions before they happen. You learn how to smooth over tension before it becomes conflict. And for a while, it feels like emotional intelligence. But over time, something subtle begins to shift. Because when your focus is constantly outward, tracking others, adjusting to others, optimizing for others, you slowly lose contact with something essential, your own internal signal. You stop asking, "What do I think about this?" and start asking, "What will they think if I say this?" That is the turning point. Because now your decisions are no longer rooted in clarity. They are rooted in prediction. And prediction is unstable. You cannot build a grounded identity on constantly shifting emotional forecasts of other people. But people try. They build their sense of worth on being agreeable, easy to be around, low conflict, low resistance. And the world rewards it. At first, you are called kind. You are called mature. You are called understanding. But underneath those compliments, something more dangerous is happening. You are becoming emotionally edited. Not by force, by habit. Every time you choose not to express discomfort, you strengthen the identity of someone who does not have discomfort worth expressing. Every time you say, "It's fine," when it is not, you reinforce the belief that your internal experience is not important enough to voice. And over time, this creates a split. On the outside, you are functional, pleasant, reliable. On the inside, you are increasingly disconnected, tired, unclear, quietly resentful, without knowing exactly why. This is the hidden cost of people-pleasing. It does not just affect how others treat you, it affects how you relate to yourself. Because self-respect is not built in grand moments. It is built in small decisions where you either acknowledge your internal truth or override it. And people-pleasers get very good at overriding. So good, in fact, that they stop noticing the moment it happens. They feel the discomfort. They sense the disagreement internally. They feel the urge to speak up. And then immediately, another process kicks in. Don't make it awkward. Just keep the peace. It's not worth it. They'll think you're difficult. And just like that, the internal signal is suppressed. Again and again. Until eventually, the signal weakens. Not because it disappears, but because it stops being trusted. And that is where self-trust begins to erode. Because self-trust is not built on being right all the time. It is built on listening to yourself consistently. When you repeatedly ignore your own discomfort, your mind learns a dangerous pattern. It learns that your internal signals are optional. And once something becomes optional long enough, it stops being authoritative. This is why many people who struggle with people-pleasing often describe the same experience later in life. They say things like, "I don't know what I want anymore," or, "I always end up doing what others expect." But that did not happen suddenly. It happened through thousands of micro-decisions where they chose external harmony over home and internal honesty. And each decision felt small enough to justify in the moment. But identity is not shaped by one decision. It is shaped by repetition. Now here is something important to understand. People-pleasing is not the same as kindness. Kindness is a choice made from strength. People-pleasing is a reaction made from fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of conflict. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of not being accepted. And when fear becomes the driver of your social behavior, your relationships stop being expressions of authenticity. They become negotiations for approval. You start managing impressions instead of expressing truth. And that creates exhaustion that is difficult to explain to others. Because from the outside, nothing seems wrong. You are not in conflict. You are not arguing. You are not creating problems. But internally, you are constantly adjusting yourself just to remain acceptable. And that constant adjustment has a cost. It drains clarity. It weakens boundaries. It blurs identity. Because you cannot fully know yourself while constantly editing yourself. There is another layer to this that is often overlooked. People-pleasing creates a false sense of control. It gives the illusion that if you behave correctly enough, speak carefully enough, and anticipate reactions precisely enough, you can prevent conflict entirely. But that is not control. That is avoidance. And avoidance always comes at a price. Because life does not become more stable when you suppress your truth. It becomes more fragile. One misunderstood moment can disrupt everything you are trying to carefully maintain. One disagreement can feel disproportionately heavy. One moment of disapproval can feel like failure. Because when your sense of stability depends on external approval, every reaction from others carries disproportionate weight. You are no longer simply interacting. You are constantly evaluating your worth through feedback. And that is not a sustainable way to live. Now here is where the shift begins. It does not begin with becoming louder. It does not begin with becoming confrontational. It begins with something much quieter, honesty. Not aggressive honesty. Not reactive honesty. But simple, grounded honesty. The kind that says, "I don't agree with that." The kind that says, "That doesn't work for me." The kind that says, "I need a moment before I respond." And at first, that honesty will feel uncomfortable, because it disrupts the pattern. It interrupts the automatic approval-seeking response. And anything that interrupts a long-standing pattern will feel wrong at first. But wrong is not always wrong. Sometimes it is just unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is where growth begins. Because every time you choose honesty over approval, even in a small moment, you begin rebuilding something that has been slowly eroding. Self-trust. You start proving to yourself that your internal experience is worth expressing, that your discomfort is valid information, not something to ignore, that your voice does not need external permission to exist. And slowly, the dynamic changes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. You begin to notice that you are less resentful, less confused about your own needs, less drained after interactions. Because you are no longer constantly performing emotional adjustments in real time. You are simply present. And presence is what people-pleasing quietly steals from you. So the real question is not whether you are a nice person. It is whether your niceness is costing you access to your own clarity. Because if you cannot hear yourself clearly anymore, then it does not matter how well others hear you. You are still missing the most important voice in the room, your own. And the moment you start listening to it again, everything begins to reorganize around that clarity. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but honestly. And that is where self-respect begins to replace self-abandonment. Not in grand declarations, but in the quiet decision to stop disappearing from your own life just to stay acceptable in someone else's. Most people confuse politeness with power. And they believe that the more polite they are, the more respected they will be. But that is not how human behavior actually works. Respect is not built on politeness. Respect is built on clarity. And clarity is something far more grounded, far more stable, and far more influential than most people realize. Because politeness, by itself, is often just social lubrication. It keeps things smooth. It avoids friction. It maintains surface-level harmony. But clarity creates structure. And structure is what people actually respond to. Let that distinction settle in. Politeness says, I hope this doesn't bother you. Clarity says, this is what I will and will not accept. Politeness asks for permission to exist comfortably. Clarity assumes the right to exist honestly. And those two energies produce completely different outcomes in relationships. Because when you are overly focused on being polite, you often end up over-explaining yourself. You soften your words. You dilute your message. You add unnecessary justification. You apologize before you even state your boundary. And what you may not realize is that every layer of over-explanation weakens the message itself. It signals uncertainty. And uncertainty is something people unconsciously pick up on immediately. Not because they are analyzing your words logically, but because they are responding to your tone, your hesitation, your emotional framing. And when uncertainty is present, boundaries lose authority. Now contrast that with clarity. Clarity is simple. It does not rush to justify itself. It does not apologize for existing. It does not expand beyond what is necessary. It simply states the reality of your position and allows it to stand. And that is where respect begins to shift. Because people don't respond strongly to emotional softness. They respond to internal certainty. Even if they disagree with you, they can still respect clarity. But they will struggle to respect confusion presented politely. This is one of the most overlooked dynamics in communication. Many people assume that being nice will prevent conflict. But what actually prevents conflict long-term is not softness. It is precision. When your communication is unclear, people are forced to interpret it. And interpretation always leads to assumptions. And assumptions are where misunderstandings, tension, and repeated boundary violations begin. But when your communication is clear, there is nothing left to interpret. There is just information. And information is easier to respect than emotion. Now here is where things become more psychologically interesting. When you are overly polite, you often unintentionally invite negotiation, because politeness leaves space. Space for reinterpretation. Space for bending the boundary. Space for testing how serious you actually are. But clarity removes that space. Not by being harsh, but by being definitive. And people respond differently to something that feels definitive. They may not like it. They may resist it internally, but they understand it. And understanding is the foundation of respect. This is why some of the most respected individuals in any environment are not necessarily the most liked in every moment. They are the most clear. Their communication is not layered with emotional cushioning. It is direct, stable, and predictable. And predictability and boundaries create psychological safety for others, even when the answer is no. because people would rather deal with a clear no than a confusing maybe that changes depending on pressure. Now think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you said yes when you meant no, just to avoid discomfort? How many times have you softened your stance just to keep things smooth? And how many times did that politeness actually lead to more respect? Or did it slowly lead to people pushing a little more, assuming a little more, expecting a little more? This is the hidden consequence of confusing politeness with clarity. Politeness without clarity becomes permission without limits. And permission without limits becomes expectation. Once expectation is established, you are no longer being engaged with as an equal. You are being engaged with as a resource. And that shift often happens so gradually that you don't notice it until you feel overwhelmed by the dynamic you are in. Now here is an important point. Clarity does not require aggression. This is where many people get stuck in false choices. They believe they only have two options: either be overly polite and passive, or be direct and aggressive. But there is a third option: calm clarity. This is the space where respect actually lives. You are not raising your voice. You are not emotionally escalating. You are not trying to dominate the interaction. You are simply stating reality without distortion. And that is powerful, because calm clarity communicates something very specific. It communicates that your boundary is not emotional. It is not situational. It is not dependent on mood. It is consistent. And consistency is what gives communication weight. Now here is something people often underestimate. You do not need to explain your clarity for it to be valid. In fact, over-explaining often weakens it, because when you feel the need to justify a boundary extensively, you are subtly communicating that the boundary itself is negotiable. But when you state it simply, you are communicating that it stands on its own. And people respond to that difference immediately, not always consciously, but behaviorally. They may still test it once, they may still push a little, but they will quickly learn whether your clarity holds or collapses under pressure. And that is where respect is actually formed. Not in the first statement, but in the consistency that follows it. Because anyone can sound clear once, but not everyone can remain clear when it becomes inconvenient. Now consider what happens internally when you start practicing clarity instead of politeness. At first, there is discomfort, because you are breaking an old habit of softening everything to avoid reaction. You might feel guilty, you might feel tense, you might even feel like you are being too direct. But what is really happening is recalibration. Your nervous system is adjusting to a new standard, a standard where your voice does not disappear in the presence of potential disagreement. And that adjustment is necessary, because every time you choose clarity, you are not just communicating differently, you are rebuilding your internal hierarchy. You are teaching yourself that your truth does not need approval to exist. And that is a fundamental shift in identity. Over time, something interesting begins to happen. You notice less confusion in your interactions. You spend less energy managing misunderstandings. You feel less resentment building silently. Because clarity removes ambiguity before it has a chance to grow into frustration. And relationships become simpler. Not easier in every moment, but clearer in structure. And structure creates stability. Now here is the deeper philosophical layer. Politeness is often about managing perception. Clarity is about expressing reality. And when you spend too much time managing perception, you slowly detach from reality. You start living in a version of yourself that is optimized for acceptance rather than truth. But truth has a grounding effect. It brings you back to yourself. It removes the constant internal tension of pretending, adjusting, and filtering. And in that space, something important returns. Self-respect. Not the loud kind, not the performative kind, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing you are no longer editing your reality just to be. Easier for others to digest. So the shift is not about becoming less kind. It is about becoming more precise. Because kindness without clarity becomes self-neglect. But kindness with clarity becomes strength. And strength is what actually earns lasting respect. Not the kind that depends on approval. but the kind that remains even when someone hears no and still understands your value. And that is the real standard. Not how well you are liked, but how clearly you are understood. Because once you are understood clearly, you no longer need to overextend yourself to be respected. Your presence alone communicates the structure you have built, and people adjust accordingly. So the question becomes very simple. Are you using politeness to connect, or are you using it to avoid being clear? Because only one of those leads to respect, and the other slowly dissolves it. And the moment you choose clarity over performance, you stop asking for respect and start naturally commanding it through the way you carry your truth. Most people imagine discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. They assume that if something feels uneasy, awkward, or emotionally heavy, it must mean they are making a mistake. But that assumption is one of the biggest reasons people stay stuck in patterns that quietly drain their self-respect. Because discomfort is not always a warning. Sometimes it is a transition, and if you do not understand the difference, you will keep mistaking growth for danger. Let that sit for a moment. When you begin setting boundaries, speaking with clarity, or stopping the habit of over-accommodating others, something predictable happens. You feel guilt, you feel tension, you feel like you are doing something wrong, even when you are doing something healthy. And that emotional response is so strong that many people interpret it as a sign to go back to their old behavior. Back to being more flexible. Back to being more agreeable. Back to being easier for others to deal with. But what they are really doing is retreating from growth. Because that discomfort is not proof of wrongdoing. It is proof of change. And change always challenges identity before it strengthens it. Your mind is not only responding to the present moment. It is also responding to every version of you that came before this one. The version that stayed quiet to avoid conflict. The version that said yes when it should have said no. The version that absorbed disrespect just to maintain connection. The version that equated being liked with being safe. That version of you was not weak. It was adaptive. It learned how to survive in environments where directness may not have felt safe, or where approval felt necessary for belonging. So when you start acting differently, your mind does not immediately recognize it as growth. It recognizes it as threat to the familiar pattern. And that is why discomfort arises. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are doing something unfamiliar. Now here is the critical shift most people never make. They try to eliminate discomfort instead of interpreting it. So every time guilt appears, they assume they need to correct their behavior. Every time tension shows up, they assume they need to soften their stance. Every time someone reacts negatively to their boundary, they assume the boundary must have been too much. But in reality, none of those reactions are proof of wrongdoing. They are simply evidence that the system is adjusting. Because when you change your behavior, you disrupt expectations. And when expectations are disrupted, people react. Not always because you are wrong, but because you are no longer predictable in the way they were accustomed to. And unpredictability forces recalibration. That recalibration is where discomfort lives. So the real question is not, why does this feel uncomfortable? The real question is, what is this discomfort responding to? Is it responding to harm you are causing? Or is it responding to a pattern you are breaking? Because those are two completely different realities. One requires correction. The other requires endurance. And most people confuse the two. This is why so many people abandon their boundaries too early. They set a limit, feel guilty immediately, and interpret that guilt as confirmation that they were too harsh. But guilt is not always a moral signal. Sometimes it is just a conditioned response, a learned emotional reaction to prioritizing yourself after years of prioritizing others. And conditioned responses do not disappear instantly. They fade through repetition. Every time you choose your boundary despite discomfort, you are not just acting differently. You are rewiring your internal associations. You are teaching your nervous system that self-respect is not dangerous. That saying no does not lead to collapse. That clarity does not destroy relationships. that your needs can exist without apology. And that process takes time, because you are not just changing behavior, you are changing identity. Now here is something important to understand. Most people think confidence is the absence of discomfort, but real confidence is the ability to act correctly while discomfort is present. It is not the elimination of guilt. It is the refusal to let guilt make decisions for you. Because if guilt becomes the decision maker, then your past patterns will always override your present growth. And you will keep returning to what is familiar, not what is healthy. This is why boundary setting feels like an internal battle at first. On one side, there is the old identity that seeks approval, avoids conflict, and prioritizes harmony at any cost. On the other side, there is the emerging identity that values clarity, self-respect, and emotional honesty. And both voices feel like you. That is what makes the transition so difficult. It is not a battle with others. It is a negotiation within yourself. But here is the turning point. The discomfort does not last forever. It only lasts as long as your identity is split between old conditioning and new awareness. Eventually, something shifts. The same situation that once triggered guilt no longer has the same emotional weight. Not because the situation changed, but because you changed. You no longer interpret self-respect as wrongdoing. You no longer interpret silence as peace. You no longer interpret over-accommodation as safety. And when that shift happens, something remarkable becomes visible. You begin to notice how much of your past behavior was driven by fear rather than truth. Not obvious fear, subtle fear. Fear of disapproval, fear of awkwardness, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing connection. And once you see that clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee, because you realize how often you abandoned yourself just to avoid temporary discomfort in others. But here is the deeper truth. The discomfort you feel when setting boundaries is temporary. The resentment you feel when you don't is cumulative. One fades, the other builds. One leads to clarity, the other leads to internal conflict that grows over time. So you are always choosing between two types of discomfort. The discomfort of growth, or the discomfort of self-abandonment, and only one of them leads somewhere meaningful. Now consider what actually happens when you consistently choose growth. At first, people around you may react. They may question you. They may test you. They may even distance themselves if they were benefiting from your lack of boundaries. And that reaction can feel intense in the beginning, but over time, something stabilizes. The people who respect clarity adjust. The people who depended on your silence reveal themselves. And the relationships that remain become more honest, more balanced, and less emotionally draining. Not perfect, but real. Because clarity filters relationships. It reveals dynamics that were already present but hidden under politeness and compliance. And that revelation, while uncomfortable, is necessary. Because you cannot build a stable life on unclear foundations. Now here is the final shift in understanding. Discomfort is not something to eliminate. It is something to interpret correctly. If it signals harm, you adjust. If it signals change, you persist. And the ability to distinguish between those two is what separates emotional reactivity from emotional maturity. Because maturity is not about avoiding discomfort. It is about understanding what it means. So when you feel that tension arise while setting boundaries, speaking honestly, or choosing yourself in a situation where you used to stay silent, do not immediately retreat. Pause and recognize what is actually happening. You are not becoming a worse version of yourself. You are becoming a more honest one. And that honesty will feel unfamiliar before it feels natural. But unfamiliar is not unsafe. It is just untrained. And everything meaningful you now value in your life once felt unfamiliar too. So let discomfort be what it actually is. Not a warning to stop, but a signal that you are no longer abandoning yourself to stay comfortable in someone else's world. And the moment you accept that, you stop fearing the very thing that is shaping you into someone stronger, clearer, and more grounded than you have ever been before. Because in the end, The real transformation is not about becoming fearless. It is about becoming someone who no longer confuses discomfort with danger. And when that happens, you finally stop running from growth and start standing inside it.